Hello, Rachelle. Hello, Kristen.
Hi.
Nice seeing you again, Jeff.
Very nice.
You too. Welcome to the Lincoln Review podcast. I'm very pleased to have you here as my guest. For the audience at home, Rachelle Villarson is the immediate past president of the Young Professionals Network of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts.
Yes, sir.
And Kristen Halbert is the current vice president of the Young Professionals Network of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts.
That I am.
So before we go too deep into anything here,
Yeah.
please tell my audience what is the Urban League and what's the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts?
So the Urban League is the oldest nonprofit civil rights organization that provides direct services to urban communities in the United States. And specifically the Young Professionals Network is the volunteer auxiliary arm. And what we do is support the Urban League movement through volunteerism, membership development, and philanthropic giving. And so what that means is that we host meetings every month where we talk about different topics that affect young professionals that relate back to the mission of the National Urban League as a whole. And we also do membership development events, and Kristen will talk about that later in terms of the membership development events that we have coming up. And in terms of philanthropic giving, we believe that, the community has to support the community, and the way that we do that is we support the Urban League movement that provides free direct services to the community in the Eastern Massachusetts through our membership dollars, through fundraising efforts, and through events as well.
I know some of the efforts for outreach and things are like education, things like that. So what are some of the specifics it focuses on? Get into some of the examples.
So the core examples, the core pillars for the Urban League are jobs, education, health, and housing. So the National Urban League believes that everybody has fair and equal access and a right to a fair job and a good paying job. Same for health, same for housing, and same for education. And so we tailor our programming on the local level for young professionals, which is ages 19 to 40, for this chapter, which is a chapter of over 62 nationwide, with over 5,000 members nationwide. And this chapter specifically has over 100 members, and we tailor our programming to talk about those things that relate to young professionals today. So for example, housing. Young professionals today are having a hard time finding housing because a lot of people are downgrading from their bigger houses to smaller houses. And so the housing that's available right now for young professionals are not the small starter houses that people normally would have had.
Right.
They're the bigger houses that are out of our price range. So we talk about how can you get housing? How can you start your journey into the real estate market and starting to build equity in your life? And we talk about strategies to do that, whether it's starting off with a condo, doing group investing, and things of that nature.
Okay. So, Kristen, what about you? What's your role in the Urban League and the Young Professionals Network?
So currently I'm the vice president, which mostly means I act as a supportive to my fantastic current president. No offense, Rachelle. My fantastic current president,
No
Liz
offense
Walker.
taken. She's awesome.
It also means that I'm there to support all of the chairs of the committees that we had. You had mentioned that we have several initiatives like youth development and education or public health. We also have civic engagement, which is where I first met you when I was the chair of that committee. But what it means is that any time that one of them is getting started, running an event, having their committee meetings, that I can be there to support them, because what Urban League does for its young professionals is it gives them this opportunity to actually hone those skills that they could use in their professional lives in a safe, inclusive environment. I mean, a lot of young professionals, especially of color, do not get the opportunity to take those chances in their professional lives. And here we say, you know what, we're going to give you the opportunity to lead. We're going to give you the opportunity to design. And while you do that, not only will you be learning, but you're also going to be supporting, empowering, and uplifting your community. And I'm there to make sure that everyone can do that.
Excellent. So clearly there's a need for the organization, right?
Absolutely.
So, I met you both a few years ago. I forget if it was at the Urban League Gala or maybe another event that, I mean, I met either of you at different points in time. Mm-hmm. And you had invited me to speak on a panel at the Young Professionals, was it a forum, or what was the event?
We were having a general body meeting, and we were talking about politics in Boston, and I invited you to come and speak on behalf of young Republicans.
Yes.
Because when at that point in time, I was president, and I felt that there was dialogue missing. A lot of us, some people are Democrats, some people are liberals, some people are originalists, and some people are Republicans. But people are just kind of stuck in their ways, and they're not willing to listen to other people talk.
Yeah.
And so my thing was, let's listen to other people talk, because it could just be that they're the same points that we're trying to make. We just have a different vision on how to get to that point. But we're all trying to get to that point.
I agree with a lot of that. And I think a lot of how we get there is when we start to argue.
Exactly.
So
how we get there is
how we get there,
the
and I think probably a bigger piece of it is some other person's vision of how is not I don't think will get there, and my vision of how would be some other person's vision
right.
of no, we won't get to there. Which is why we have politics and stuff like that. But
right.
I appreciated that invitation, and I've tried to stay in touch and keep the relationship open for things like this. I started this podcast a few years ago with the idea that I think there's a gap in the media today, especially in Boston, but also nationwide. But it's changing, where we don't dive deep enough into issues, and we don't talk honestly about what we're either feeling, or we're just kind of spitting out talking points, which I've done. I'm guilty of it. I went on TV and for all of 2016 and did election coverage and kind of played my part a little bit. Also gave some honesty, but also played my part because I'm a Republican.
Right.
And it's shallow. It's not nutritious. You know what I mean? It's not intellectually nutritious.
Right.
Whereas this, where you and I, and we can sit and have a little bit of a deeper conversation about what that means. So I'm going to start off with some questions, and we've gotten some background about the organization you're in.
Yeah.
And I want to maybe scratch away at some of the need for the organization. So it serves a community of color.
Correct.
And
majority community of color.
Majority of community of color.
Right.
But it's always there for any urban resident who feels that they need assistance to walk into those doors.
Right.
Exactly.
Why do you think the need for the organization exists? And is it maybe the lack of it in place, the education and support structure in the community to begin with? Is it cultural, household, individual? I mean, it serves a value. The Urban League is a wonderful organization that does very good things.
Great work.
But there isn't an equivalent organization necessarily that
on
serves
that scale.
Yeah, that
right.
serves other communities, or if I'm going to, the white community or something like that.
Right.
So let's talk about that.
So I think the Urban League serves a majority people of color community, right? We do have people who are not people of color that come into the doors and to partake in the services. And I think we have to get away from it being a situation of race. Race plays a part, but it's more a situation of class. And so, And so when I say class, is that the system, as we know it now, in the governmental system, is flawed in the sense that the more you have, the better off you are. In the way I see it, the less you have, the less access you have to things that can make you lift yourself up. And this whole thing about, a couple years ago, what was it about? I built this. What was it again?
You didn't build that with Elizabeth Warren?
We built this.
We built this, or pull yourself up, or
like bootstrapping.
Bootstrapping, yeah. And so when people talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, I think people have to understand you have to have the bootstraps to pull yourself up with.
Agreed. It's I don't think you'd get many Republicans or even conservatives that would disagree with that.
Right.
The escaping poverty is incredibly
It's
hard.
incredibly
Incredibly
difficult.
hard. You're born. No, not born, but you're in a situation.
You can't be born into poverty.
Oh, of course,
Absolutely.
of course.
Yeah,
No,
you're
but I'm
right.
saying-
You're right. Yeah.
What I meant to say is you don't have to be born.
Right,
into
you
it.
don't- right.
But you're in a situation where the deck is already stacked against you,
Right.
Very much so.
and it's incredibly hard to know what you don't know.
Right. Exactly.
And you're right. The not pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, you could make the argument that everybody has at least a little bit of a bootstrap, but some are stronger than others.
You're right.
So that's a good point. And why the Urban League exists. And I'm glad we're mentioning that. I mean, Kristen, what are your thoughts on maybe the
I
bootstrap?
like that you said everyone has a bootstrap because I think a lot of times people think of bootstrapping and they only really think of those kind of financial assists. And the thing is that people have emotional bootstraps that other people don't
Yes,
have.
yeah.
People have familial ones. Education, network. There are lots of different types of bootstraps, and most people have something that can place them above maybe their neighbor, the person down the street, or another person that needs help. So we also have to just start thinking a little bit more about what you can do past finances.
Are there cultural conversations that go on with Urban League community members or outside of that acknowledge this and say, what do you do about it? What are things we can begin to discuss to change? I know for me, my political and social philosophy is more individualistic. There's
Right.
it's the small unit of I'm responsible for my actions. I'm responsible for my actions with my family. I'm taking care of my family, things like that, and it grows outward from there.
Mm-hmm.
And watch out for my neighbors, watch out for my town, my state, and
It continues.
and continues from that point.
Right.
Is there a cultural deficit in the urban community that the Urban League and organizations like that's helping to fill, and what can we do to fill that deficit?
Can I go?
Yeah.
All right. So when you say the urban community, that's really difficult because even if you go to Dudley Square, I mean, you have got first generation people, you have got Caribbean, you've got Asian, you've got white, you've got everybody. And I mean, we all make up the fabric of the urban community. So when I think culturally, I can't even think as a African American who was descended from slaves, my culture is going to be different than Rachelle's, who's Haitian. But outwardly, someone might think that, we have the black agenda because we're both black people walking down the street until you know what our background is. And certainly it's just completely different. So when I think if there is a deficit culturally, I don't think that I could agree with that. I think that we've just faced different struggles based on the backgrounds that we have, and how we've addressed them can be incredibly, incredibly personal rather than all black people or all Haitian people or all Asian people, honestly.
So, but if we go back to the question I'm asked you, what personally are the conversations that you have? Not even extrapolating it out to different backgrounds within a community, but what conversations are you having that include, that go beyond your activity at the Urban League? So, meaning, what are you seeing out there that okay, you're doing 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the Urban League, but you know what, 5, 6, 7, and 8 really don't have a place there, but they're important to talk about. Either personally, within your family, within your friends,
Right.
That's what I'm trying to get at when I say, maybe culture, but community is maybe the better word. But then,
Community, I think, is a better word.
Then maybe a community deficit, rather than a cultural one.
I can say that I know within my circle, my group of friends, my network, that we have those conversations, and the conversations really center around the lack of community that we see. And it's not just within the Black community or the Hispanic community, it's within the community as a whole, that there seems to be less care for others than there was 10, 15 years ago.
So
Absolutely.
we're talking specifically about the location.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't think it's just centered in Boston either. The other day I was having a conversation with a friend, and I was talking about, when I grew up in New York, I was okay hanging out in Harlem 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. My family knew where I was.
At how old were you?
I wasn't that.
She was what she was. She was what she was.
I'm just saying, my family, no matter where I was hanging out, my family wouldn't have been okay with at one or 2 in the morning. But
my mom didn't
maybe
exactly
we'll edit
know
it
that
when
it
you
was
share this with your mom. We'll edit this part out.
So we're just going to edit this part out.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, I felt comfortable being on the stoop in Harlem, and I felt safe. I don't feel that I could do that today. And I think it's because there's a lack of community, and because we have stopped caring about each other. We're always concerned about self and getting our own and getting mine and making sure my people are good. And once we move away from that, if we can get back to making sure that, yes, we have to make sure we take care of self. A thing that I always talked about when I was president of YPN, of the Urban League, was the analogy of the airplane mask. When there's a drop in pressure,
Right.
the oxygen mask comes down. The first thing they say is, don't give it to somebody else. Put it on yourself first, and then help the person next to you.
Right.
And so it's a good analogy for life, because you do have to help yourself first. There's nothing wrong with having your own self and taking care of yourself. But once you do that, remember the person next to you. And I think that's what we're missing right now in this community, and politically and socially and culturally, is that people are just concerned about self. Once we get away from being concerned about self and understand that we are all interconnected, and the success of us is dependent on the success of other people at the same time, once we can understand that, I think we can move in a more positive direction.
I definitely have to agree with Rachelle. And, I'll bring it back to Boston. When I think of my neighbors, I live in a 3-family in Roxbury. And I've just moved there, but I already know my first floor and my second floor neighbors. My next door neighbor has introduced himself to me. I've already been to my neighborhood association meeting, and it's been less than 4 weeks. But part of that is I already know that those are the things that I am supposed to do to develop community, to make the connections, to feel safer, but also just to care about what's happening inside of my street. And it's a really, really hard here, especially as the development is going forward. It's more expensive to live. And how many people have the time to drop into their neighborhood association to hang out with their neighbors, or just be around, when you are working a 16-hour day to keep a tiny roof over your head with 4 other roommates.
And you barely have time to eat
changing
dinner.
And changing where you live every year because of price concerns. Some of it, and the lack of community, is also just a reflection of just the way things are going right now for the state, especially of young Bostonians. I mean, some of us don't have time to see our own family and friends, much less give back to the community. I think that's why I feel every single moment and every single person that walks into one of our meetings on a Thursday night is so important to me and so precious, is because they have carved this time out, and they have taken that time away from something that they really needed or wanted to do to give back and to learn more and to try. And I gotta say, it's really hard. And when people don't come to that table, I understand, because it is very difficult.
It's a commitment.
It is a
Absolutely
commitment. And to make a commitment, you have to maybe put something aside. Am I replacing the class that you would normally be at on Thursday? Am I replacing an extra shift that would have made your groceries a little bit easier this week? Am I replacing the one night you had in 3 weeks to actually recharge?
It's a sacrifice.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I mean, you're both bringing up good points. do you struggle with the idea? Because I would imagine that it gets difficult to I won't say you're trying to change the behavior of other people or to get them more involved, which can be near impossible. Because some people just don't care. Some people are too busy, like you mentioned. Or some people might just not be interested in doing it. Is it... I wonder, because there's people in the Urban League that, they recognize the value of it, of the organization, of what you're talking about. Education, community involvement, things like that. But if they come to a point where they're like, you know what, it might be easier for me to move and buy a house a little bit outside the city with the yard, and there's not a community association, and kind of my neighbors are cool, we wave, and, they keep to themselves, I keep to myself, raise my family and do that. That's, I think, the natural gravitation for most people. Most people, not everybody. But you want to start a family, or you want to pursue whatever you want to pursue. Maybe it's not a family, but trying to keep, I don't know. How big of a struggle is it to keep that community involvement going? Because I got to imagine it's trying to,
It's a
like
huge,
it's like try it's like throwing.
Yeah.
Rachelle, I think
I'm trying to think of the right analogy, trying to stop the dam from overflowing.
Yeah, it's a huge struggle, especially for people under 45.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say specifically people under 45, because we're not settled. We don't have that sense of community because we are, like Kristen mentioned earlier, we're constantly trying to move and be stable, and it's hard to do because cost of living is going up, but wages aren't matching that rise.
Right.
And so we have to constantly try to find ways to survive in a city that doesn't seem to appreciate our presence.
But what if you... Clearly, the organization and what you're doing helps the individuals who are a part of it. And as you help those individuals, they're going to be better people, more stable people, better, create family bonds and better jobs and better education, and that carries forward into future years and generations.
Absolutely.
Is that enough? Can it be an organization of feeding the need of people who need the things that you're providing, and absent of that sense of community? I guess what I'm getting at is, like, what's the better outcome? If the people who are part of the Urban League get a lot out of it, or any other organization for that matter, but they get a lot out of it, and their lives, the value of their lives, or self-esteem and things are improved for themselves. That in and of itself is a win.
Right.
The idea that it still needs to be located, in the neighborhood where it does, is that integral to a part of it, or is it more about the mission of who you're helping as an individual?
It's both.
Okay.
Absolutely.
It's definitely both. It's about helping people better themselves.
Is one harder than the other, or are they both equally?
They're both equally hard.
Yeah.
Because you have to get people to want to better themselves, and then they have to do the work to better themselves.
Right.
So them walking in the door is the first step, but then they have to sit there and persevere. So that's the first part. But then the second part of the community aspect is understanding, and I think, at least with the young professionals, creating that sense of community is a lot easier. I can't really speak to groups outside of the young professionals within the Urban League, but we're all Urban Leaguers. But specifically within the young professionals, wherever we go, we have a community. For example, the secretary that just departed, she moved back home to Philadelphia, but she came from Philadelphia to Boston. She got connected with the Urban League because her family was connected with the Urban League in Philadelphia.
Right.
And so because she knew her family was connected with the Urban League in Philadelphia, she came here to Boston knowing that she would be welcome, and she created that community.
That's great, yeah.
I have friends that I met through the Urban League, lifelong friends that I probably would have never met otherwise. And I know that at the drop of a dime, if I needed them, I have that community to go to. I could go to California tomorrow and say, I need a bed for a night and I'll have 3 offers by the end of the day. And so that's what the Urban League does specifically for young professionals, I think, is that it creates that sense of community, that common bond that says...
Well, yeah. So there's, I guess, the micro and the macro.
The micro and the macro.
Yeah.
And it bleeds out. It definitely bleeds out 10 times over, because once you have that sense within yourself and you know that you have that network that you can go back to, then you feel comfortable enough to go out and venture outside of your circle and start creating those other networks, knowing that if it doesn't work out there, you have something to fall back to inside that makes you comfortable. And it's like you said about having a place to try things out and not being afraid to fail. It's the same thing. Like, you can try things out and you're okay with understanding that I'll try it out. If it doesn't work, I know it's going to be okay.
Right.
Because I know these people are here to help. And I think that's what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, because especially for the YPs, if I have a committee chair who has never planned a conference before or a meeting or even designed a flyer for an event, I'm not just going to be like, this is your month, see you in 3 weeks, this better be great. Or how it might be like if you were at your job.
You wouldn't be good at your job if you did that. Yeah.
I'm going to be there and we're going to have group discussions. And if I'm not sure, like, I'm going to call Rachelle or I'm going to call a previous VP. I'm going to be like, hey, like, I have a problem and I really would love it if you would talk to my new chair of public health, because that's not my strong suit, but I know that you're really great at it. And it creates this phenomenal alumni network, which is a great proving ground for moving on to higher service, like Rachelle being in national service. And she is not even the only one of our alumni from the board to be called up to a national level. And that sense of community, it's very pervasive. It's not just that I'm an Urban League YP. I'm also with the New Leaders Council here. And part of the reason that I was able to even say yes to applying for the civic engagement chair position was because my brother, who was a former YP VP, nominated me for NLC, and he did that knowing that it would give me the knowledge and skills to go to this position, because he knew that what I really wanted to do was help the community in the way that the Urban League would help me.
Right.
But it was just another organization and another sense of community that's really helped me get more into Boston and see the problems and be more invested in fixing them and feeling how secure I am and wanting everyone else to feel that secure. I know what you said about it could be self-perpetuating, just like, oh, we could just help people and then those people could be our helpers, but that's so inward turning. We also need are the people who weren't helped by the Urban League through a program or through like a resume building to just be like, I want to help those people because I see those people who are in my community. And even though the Urban League isn't giving me like this physical thing or this class, like I want to go there and help because I want us all to be together and I'm secure and I want this person to be secure. Like, we need both sides.
Right. Well, I think that's a common cause of a lot of people of faith, religion, helping. If you're a Christian, Catholic, whatever, you're taught that's what you're supposed to do and go out and help and be of service to other people. So I think there's that common thread that runs through it. So
I agree.
Kristen, you mentioned something, and this will be fun. You mentioned some of the problems. Let's talk about. Well, because let's bring it back to Boston a little bit, and because you said some of the problems. So before I forget that we mentioned it before I started recording, how I guess the difference between what we disagree with politically is how we get to the place that we want to get to.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of us say that how doesn't get us to the place we want to get to, and that's why we disagree. So what are some of the problems that you're seeing that need to be addressed, and how do you think they should be addressed?
Ooh.
And
go ahead, Kristen.
And I'll point this out. You don't have to, name names or say anything.
We're not going to name names.
Name names.
We're going to leave names out of it.
So what's going on, and what do you think needs to be done to help some of the problems?
Still in the vein of community, The Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce actually just completed a 6-day festival here in Boston called the Fierce Urgency of Now Festival, or Fun in Boston. And it was dedicated to looking at the problems, especially of millennials of color in Boston, the surrounding areas, about how we weren't really happy with living here, working here, or getting educated here, even though millennials of color make up over 40% of the greater Boston workforce. But we are more likely to have worse outcomes than any of the other groups. So over the course of this, I've been going to events at the Chamber of Commerce, at clubs, at outdoor places that do not see a lot of people of color, like the Lawn on D. And we have had discussions about education, about housing. We've had discussions about socializing, and then we know about socializing, about new emerging industries like the cannabis stores that will be opening shortly in the Boston area, eventually, someday. In the Boston area.
Do you like them, or are you pro, or you con, or what are you thinking?
I am pro cannabis stores. I feel like the tax revenue alone is going to be fantastic, but I also realize that because of especially the lines, traffic patterns, and they have very, very specific areas where they can be cited, that we're going to have a lot of community input to make sure that they actually get placed in neighborhoods and areas of the city where they're going to thrive, but that they're also going to be a benefit to the neighborhood and the neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was always forward thinking about that. I never viewed marijuana as something that it was, arguably alcohol is more detrimental.
Agree.
Regulate it, tax it, control it. Got to have an ID. Don't drive when you're using it. All that, just the normal stuff.
All that common sense stuff that you do for alcohol.
I'd like to kind of ease that into so it's like a situation as it is with alcohol as best we can, and going along the lines of what you're talking about. So you're talking about you met with you're going to these Chamber of Commerce meetings, socializing, with the goal of addressing what? You mentioned it's struggling. Millennials of color, 40% of the workforce in Boston.
Yes.
And
what we're learning is that it's difficult for us, and some of it is not having that whole sense of community. Like I am a well-networked person. Like, I'm not ashamed of that. I work really hard to make sure I know about what's happening in a lot of points of the city. But I was seeing people who had no idea about the YPs, people who had no ideas about some of the programs for housing, who didn't know about scholarships in the city, who had no clue about that there was like a Black or a Latino or an Asian affinity group on their campus. So one of the things that I've learned from these last 6 days is definitely there needs to be more education, but there just needs to be more education about all the options and resources that are out there. Like, Boston is very resource rich, but sometimes we can actually be results poor even with all of the resources. And it's just because people don't know that they're out there. So that is definitely one thing that we have to work on. We also have to work on making sure that as we grow as a city, and Boston is a booming city right now.
I used to live, a couple miles from here. And when I did, there was not all this construction. It was, when did I move out of the city? 2009, so coming up on 10 years. In 10 years, it has changed so much.
Different.
It has changed significantly.
So,
and change can be good. Change can absolutely be good. It just has to be
are included.
When all people are included, and it does have to be thoughtful about protecting certain parts of the area, but still allowing it to grow. There are a lot of people who may say no to a lot of development to protect the culture of their neighborhood, but those people may not be there in the future, and you may find like 10 or 15 years down the line that something that would have completely fit in that you just needed more thought about was something that had been shut down by an association that existed before you even knew that that neighborhood was there. And those people are long gone, having, as Rachelle said, downsized, sold their home, and moved off to something like super cute and out of our price range.
Right. So what lack of being informed is one of the things you're talking about. So when I think of the problems that are going on that in Boston that need to be addressed, it's a political debate, it's a class debate in the terms of the price of real estate,
especially depending on which neighborhood you're looking at.
Right. I can remember years ago when I did live in the city. Rent was reasonably, it was still high, but obviously but you could sort of swing it, and I was by myself for a while. I could kind of make it, but then I did actually start to look to maybe I should buy a condo, and then immediately I got down to earth. Now, this was before the financial crash of 2008.
Right.
So when I went to the bank, they're like, "Oh, you don't need any money down, and sure, we'll give you several $100,000 worth of loans." And I even said to myself, "Yeah, I don't think this is not a good idea." Because one, I was like, "What's my mortgage payment going to be, and what's my interest?" And it wasn't a good idea for me at the time, and I had the financial sense to know not to do that. Maybe and that's something that people. If you don't know not to do that, you might just sign on the dotted line, and then where you go.
Then we have the mortgage crisis.
Right. So since that point.
But we also offer those classes.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So you have financial education, which is key.
We do have financial
that the Urban
education.
League offers. But since then, housing boom. Because we have a jobs boom. The unemployment is very, very low in Massachusetts and in the city of Boston, which is always a good thing. People are working. Working is good. You're earning a wage. You're doing well. The question is like, I think we've been having this discussion probably for decades, is that the money that you earn doesn't go as far or seem to go as far as it used to.
Right.
And the standard of living. So we're having situations where, there's $1 million 800 square foot apartments right down the road that
are being built right around the corner.
Right. So it's it's going further and further out. So the prices start to go further and further out into Dorchester, into Roxbury, anywhere where it's suddenly like, well, yeah, that's pretty close to downtown, or that's good to my commute, and it has that effect.
Right.
And I talked about this with Carlos on the last episode I did with a video, and we were getting into it. So I think we had some common ground. He saw some of my points and I saw some of his, and that seems to be the major, thing we're debating over here in Boston. I might be off on this. You guys tell me what you're thinking, but I think the main argument, a lot of people who are heavily involved in Boston politics, Boston community organizations, is how expensive it is.
Yes.
Now these are problems, but I'm going to put on my Republican hat and say, but they're kind of good problems to have, sort of, because you're talking about a situation where lots of people are working, and because lots of people are working, they're competing.
People are looking for housing.
They're competing for the houses because people are getting education and moving on to better jobs. It's supply and demand, and we're building thousands of new units on top of it.
Right.
How does the gentrification that's taking place, how does all that stuff affect your attitudes personally and what you're hearing and feeling and talking about in the community in Boston?
So I can tell you, I'm in the process of looking for a home.
It's fun, isn't
Currently.
it?
Yeah. I have quickly stopped. And the reason why I have quickly stopped is because I realized I work in the city of Boston. I work for a government agency in the city of Boston, and I can't afford to live on my own in the city of Boston.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who work for the city of Boston can't afford to live in the city of Boston, but they have to. So you're forced to have roommates, and it's cool to have roommates at 21, but when you are a little older.
Well, this is the thing I noticed personally. Like I could afford to rent a small studio apartment by myself.
Right.
And that's about it. And like I said, I looked at the mortgages and I was like, wow, I can't afford this. But met a lovely woman, moved out. I moved out of the city. But even if she had moved in, like, we got married. I don't know how I'm 42.
Right.
I'm just out of the age group of the young organizations.
Definitely
I used to be. I was vice chair of the Young
you're
Republicans.
Good. You're good.
But I still look back at it. It's close enough. And I know people of our age in their 30s, maybe early 40s, were delaying when our parents got married. I mean, my father and 23 and 22 or something like that when they got married. Now, I look at somebody who's 23 or 22 getting married, and if you're listening to this and you are that age, I apologize. I go,
disclaimer.
Just saying.
I go, oh boy, you should just wait a few years, man.
Right.
Just wait you're not ready. But that's my
Full
perspective.
disclosure.
I could be completely wrong. On
I'm
that.
37. I'm not married.
Right.
And I have never been married. And so, and I am delayed.
Well, but I'm saying, but it's I think it's for our generation. So you're 37, you're Gen X. So you're Gen X like me. I think there's this decision where we say, well, I'm not ready to get married yet, or maybe you are ready to get married, but a few years ago you weren't, or when I wasn't. But that I wasn't is a full decade later than when our parents would. So what we're seeing is these life decisions and choices that we've made, kind of having the repercussions that maybe our parents didn't see, because granted it was maybe a different generation and maybe moms could stay at home, right. And then the job situations were different, but even then, even if you kind of pull that forward, both parents and husband and wife have been working in the workforce for quite a long time, but they were living together, sharing expenses and doing all that stuff. So as our generation doesn't do that,
right,
I think I didn't look at it at the time, but it's a bit of a self-inflicted wound, financially, so to speak. And since I've been married now, 9 years being married, and I noticed, it's like, wow, I have more money. And it wasn't by miracle. I didn't hit the lottery. It was just
the combined income.
I would love to know that feeling, by the way.
But it's true.
Combined income.
But the combined income and the not going out every Saturday night and the things
on a date,
yeah,
right?
Or something.
Yeah.
I mean, you slow down when you get older.
Yeah.
But,
Netflix, man.
Right.
Netflix. You're gonna say it could save the economy,
right?
They might very well do that. So I think there's many different factors that go into, because this is a city full of young single people.
Exactly.
It is one of the highest populations in the country, and I know that we also get dinged a lot on those horrible, public interest surveys online saying oh, Boston is such a cold and mean city when you go to it. No one will date anybody. And Match.com's like, why are we even here? But
everybody's on Tinder though.
Yeah, but I also want to remind people
I thank God every day that app wasn't around. I mean, there was Match.com when I was single, and I gave up on it because this is awful. Yeah. And I met my wife through friends, but I don't even
You're not missing
Tinder
anything.
is like, oh God.
You're not missing anything.
It's like
you're not.
Match.com
also,
on
because
steroids.
you can screenshot Tinder and those kind of things are very dangerous right now.
The internet lasts forever.
It's gone.
So a possibility.
We've got this situation where we've got a lot of younger, single, educated, making fine, decent, even very good to decent money in that range, and there's thousands upon thousands of people competing for the same house. So we have a situation where that's a problem. I think it's a good problem to have, but you're seeing it affect communities around the city, and we have these disagreements of, well, I don't want this neighborhood to change that much.
Well, I think I think it's more. Yeah, we have a more educated workforce, and the more educated workforce means that there's more money. But you're right, money does not carry the same way it did 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so that's one problem. The other problem is there is an educated workforce, but there's also an uneducated workforce that didn't want to go to college, couldn't afford to go to college, or even a community school. And so they have to live too. And the housing market is great. Don't get me wrong. I think it is a good problem to have this competition, but it's also bad because this is where the gentrifying comes in, because then you're forcing these people to move out. So I'm going to mention the BHA and the memo that was put out last week.
I didn't read it. Can you explain?
Let's explain it.
Absolutely.
So the Boston let's get comfortable. So the Boston Housing Authority put out a memo last week to people that were on the voucher system and said, hey, do you want better education? Do you want to live in a city?
Can you explain just briefly for the audience the voucher system?
Oh, I'm sorry. So Section 8, essentially.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's other stuff besides Section 8, but it's majority Section 8.
Okay.
And that's assisted living for people that they get assistance from the government to find housing in the city, to live in the city.
Okay.
And it depends on your income or lack of income. So they put out a memo to people on this voucher system that said, do you want a better education for your child? Do you want to live in a city with no crime? Your best option is to move out of the city. And so me, as living in a city for all of my life, first in New York, in Brooklyn, and then here in Boston, from Rosendale to now Hyde Park, I took extreme offense to that. Because I live here, I work here, I care about this community.
Is that's a government organization, or
Yes.
is that
It's a government organization.
It's a city agency.
City
And
agency.
honestly, it was a horrible rollout
Horrible.
of a program that was just supposed to be designed that if you did want to move out of Boston, they would help you.
Right.
They would
but
help
the
you.
way
They'd provide
that was
assistance.
presented was
Atrocious.
like
absolutely
heavy-handed,
atrocious.
saying kind of
This
let's-
city
ham-handed.
Yeah, ham-handed.
that the city sucks and it's crime ridden and the education system sucks, so you need to move out so you can get a better life. That's the way it was perceived.
It's not. I would. That's probably not accurate because
is not.
people want to come here. All right,
do.
so
Right. I'm sorry if
I'm
you
gonna
looked
put
at public education
Here's my cynical hat.
other else in the
Go ahead.
I'm going to
country,
put my
BTS.
cynical hat on.
Go for
Is
it.
that
Yeah.
they did it to get people who would, any residents that they could that were occupying houses that
Keep
they
on
could
going.
then, either or flip to other property owners, yada yada yada. To kind of get light a little fire under their butt,
Exactly.
to get them out of the city, to open up more units, to do whatever with.
Exactly.
Which is assuming, maybe, converting it into condos, which lead to more tax revenue and
Exactly.
things like that. So that's my
And that's
initial
exactly the
thought.
way the community perceived it.
Okay.
They perceived it as you're trying to entice us to leave the city so you can take this housing, switch it over, create more tax revenue by making condos, and then you're going to essentially bring in other people that don't match the culture of this community.
Which also is a very serious concern, not just for this letter that has gone out, but because a lot of public housing, they're when they're revamping it, and we all know what happened with the Hope 6 projects.
Yep.
And
I don't.
Oh, okay.
Go for
Jeff
it.
doesn't. Okay.
What's Hope 6?
So Hope 6 is a program that had gone in and they redid and rebuilt and upgraded a lot of public housing. But the thing was
where did this take place?
Hope 6 was a national program.
Okay.
It was a national program. But some of the problem was that if you were already in that housing, you had to leave during the period that they were rehabbing
okay.
it. And not everyone who left was able to come back.
Did that take place over at the D Street projects in South Boston? Because I remember when they tore those red brick buildings down. So I lived in this area in 10 years ago, from 98 to 03. So 5 years. Well, 5 years here, and then I moved over to Back Bay. But I remember at some point when I was living around here, they tore down the D Street projects and they put up nicer new townhome looking things. Maybe that was a part of it, but that's what you're saying.
Part of it.
Well, they might have been abandoned too, or mostly abandoned. But anyway, sorry.
I think it definitely happened on Washington Street.
Yes, it did happen.
Yeah, it definitely happened
Okay.
on Washington Street in Rosendale.
All right.
Going towards Dedham. The people that lived there before they tore it down are not the same people that are there now.
Okay,
And
so
part of
they
the
were
problem is
displaced.
that they actually changed the kind of people that could get in there.
Yeah.
And we have
They
to
raised the income levels.
They raised income levels.
Okay.
There were new limitations put on there about people who had criminal backgrounds.
Yep.
And one of the problems is if
Stricter
you were
criminal backgrounds.
Stricter criminal backgrounds, and that's a problem. Like if you had a son that committed a crime,
They couldn't
and they
live
have
there.
a Corey, your son can't come and live with you.
Okay.
If you are in a community that is ravaged by an awful criminal justice system, and your husband or your wife, your son or your brother gets out and needs a place to stay, and you are in this public housing, you cannot house them.
Or else you risk
could
losing
risk
your own
losing,
house.
yeah.
You lose your own house. So, I mean, even just the way that it's set up is already set up to break up communities, to break up families.
Right. Which leads back to the lack of community that we're experiencing, which is causing this negative feedback loop.
Yeah.
And you're taking away, you could be having everyone living under one roof with two incomes, and instead you have to run two households, one income for each household. The other person can't probably get the same subsidized housing as the wife with the kids
Yeah.
who might who can't bring you back
So-
into the home. Like there are many ways that it is impacting what everyone's just seeing from
So
the
what was the
outside.
reaction to the BHA letter? I mean, has there been any? I mean, obviously people were upset by it.
Right.
Very upset.
So
They quickly
is
pulled
this-
it
is
back.
this-
And
is it-
Mayor
they
Walsh
did.
came out very strongly against
Yeah,
it.
they
Okay.
quickly
Yeah.
pulled it back. It went up on a couple of bulletin boards, and was quickly taken down, I think, the next day or that night. But the problem was that it was already up on bulletin boards. People already saw it. So people already took a picture of it. And
It was
social
already in
media is
Yeah, it was
people's
there,
great.
there
emails.
forever. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's there forever. And then on top of that, it went out a couple of days later in different languages,
Oh.
which is the procedure for the city of Boston.
But they didn't stop it from
But
going
they didn't
out.
stop
Yeah,
it. So
okay.
then it went out again.
So, let me say, as you know, again, putting my Republican hat on, you
Yes.
know, because whether you know it or not, you're on a political podcast.
I had no idea.
see-
oh my God.
See, when
We're
that's
a
one
nonpartisan
thing where
organization.
Yes,
so,
we are.
you know, most Republicans should believe in the free market, so to speak. Maybe there's limitations and regulations on that market. But that's what you're talking about, the BHA getting directly involved with that. I mean, that's the government perverting the system, or, you know, what would be somewhat of an organic system. It's,
Right.
They're coming in with a heavy hand, and
Yes.
in this case, the rollout of ham hand, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And trying to force an outcome
Right.
that they think is going to be
It's going to be better. Right.
Yeah.
they think. Now, I'm of the mind that kind of along the lines of what we've been discussing, the communities have a better feel
For
for
what
what
they
they need.
They
Right.
do.
And you know, when you talk about something like, you know, the heavy-handed force of government, you know, most Republicans should come out against that in terms of that type of thing taking place. But maybe they've learned the error of their ways. Maybe they haven't, and maybe they're just going to be a little bit
Yeah.
more sly about it next time. Aside from that, I mean, is there pushback in communities where you're seeing the prices go up to the gentrification, and why? Does it go beyond? Is it just a question of different skin colors moving into the neighborhood, or is it a question of class, or is it a question of both, or is it a question of something that I'm not mentioning that I don't know about?
It's a question of all of that.
Okay.
Honestly.
It's both and then some.
And I know there's
What's,
even
well, let's
more.
get into the
What's
what's
then some?
what's the then some?
So I think the then some is the culture.
Yes.
I mentioned I lived in Brooklyn for a while, in
Yeah.
Harlem. The Harlem that I knew growing up is not the same Harlem today. The culture is different. The vibe is different in terms of the cultural diversity. People love to move into cultural diversity neighborhoods, and that's great. But then when you move in, you realize that you're changing the makeup of it. And so there is an example. I don't remember when it exactly happened, but it was something, I think it was in California. And I think it was in California. And then there was a church in the community. And the church was a very boisterous church. I think it was Baptist. And they had a very loud church service.
Okay.
As Baptist churches do.
Baptists tend to be loud.
Right. They
Yeah.
love to sing, and they
Yes,
love
we do.
Yeah, they love to sing. They love the drums, and I love it. And so these people moved into the community, and they were white, and they didn't appreciate, they loved the church, but they didn't appreciate the noise. So they would make noise complaints.
Okay.
And so it's just like, it's things like that.
It's the little things. They feel personal when it happens. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It feels personal, and you're changing the culture of that community. When you do things, when things are like that happen, you change the culture of the community. So it's not just about race. It's not just about class, but it's also about the cultural diversity that you're affecting when you go into a community, and people are not sensitive to that.
Well, that's something that can be true, I think, anywhere. Is when you when new people, wherever you are, wherever the people are, and this is all across the planet, people are in a place. New people come into that place. Those new people want to change what's going on in that place. The people that are there don't necessarily like it or
And
dislike
there's
it.
the key: want to change.
Oh, but you can also move into a place and not want to change the landscape of the place. You just don't want to change or moderate your own behavior.
Right.
In Boston, for example, the biggest concern about gentrification is probably because of, and let's be honest, students.
Right.
Students moving into neighborhoods, students taking like a triple decker, and instead of a family going in there, it's like 6 students all living together because like they're fine with that. And the rents that the landlord can charge them are incredibly lucrative, and he's fine with the fact that the family's not there. A lot of times we also have a lot of absentee landlords.
Right.
But the thing is, in a neighborhood, when you suddenly have this large influx of students, the students may not be there to change the culture of your street, but certainly the students are there to exhibit student culture. You may not have people that don't want to...
I'm with you.
Right. You may not have people who don't want to have parties or who know about proper trash pickup.
No. Let me tell you something right now. I think, listen...
Yeah.
The students don't pay taxes.
Right.
Okay. The students may pay rent, but the students don't vote.
Right.
The students don't pay taxes.
We want students to vote. I mean, we will help hold voter registration drives constantly.
Maybe. Not all of us want students to vote.
Let's see how these primaries come out when these like data come out about you telling me students and millennials don't vote.
But that's a good point.
Yeah.
So, the idea that students moving into neighborhoods that you'd probably prefer to see families move into,
it's very real.
That's pretty real.
But you can also have
Hill.
responsible students. I don't want to say that all students are irresponsible. There's an extra layer of work that has to be done for teaching a 19-year-old who has never lived outside of their family's house, like the actual proper care of the neighborhood and the being respectful of your neighbors, even while like you're starting to like feel yourself. Honestly.
Right. Yep. I mean, Mission Hill is a prime example.
That's out by Northeastern.
Of student displacement. I started out my collegiate career at Northeastern. I didn't finish there. But I remember specifically when the new dorms went up on West Village, there was supposed to be housing within that dorm specifically for the people of that community because they displaced people in that community. And to this day, I don't think I've seen that happen the way it was supposed to happen. And so then people don't want to live in the dorms. So they move out into the neighborhood. They want to be close to the school.
Yeah.
So you continue to push people out. And when you push people out and you have the students, people raise the rents because they know they can get the students, because they know the parents are going to pay it. And so that's where, once again, this is the displacement of families, of cultures, of communities that happen. And there has to be a solution.
And even if you have great students and just having a series of bad students as tenants can create a real tension in a neighborhood, a very anti-student feeling that student maybe completely did not deserve. Maybe they did come from a responsible family, or they came from...
But they have that stereotype already.
Yeah, I've met some phenomenal neighborhood-oriented Northeastern students who will show up at neighborhood association, who will be there manning the grill, who will watch your kids. They're great neighbors. That's not all of them, and I've met horrible ones.
Look, you only need a small percentage.
You only need a small percentage
to make that impression and to
push
it
ruin it for everybody.
Time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's Boston. We have that big, huge student population, so there's a lot of flux going on. Is it? I mean, you've both talked about displacement. And usually the individuals and families that get displaced are ones that are earning a lower income.
Yes.
This is something where I talked about the free market before and stuff, where I go, I don't want to sound like a cold Republican here, but I'm almost like, okay, the neighborhood's changing. More folks are getting educated. They're taking the cues from the organizations like the Urban League. They're bettering themselves. They're making more money. They're doing better. They're getting into a situation where, you know what, I want to live a little close to the city. Oh, you know what, I can buy this. And then the owner of a property decides to sell it, kick out the renters who are there who aren't paying as much rent.
Yeah.
So someone like yourself can buy it.
Right.
That's a trade-off. There's good and there's bad. It is the idea, because I struggle with the idea that there should be some forced solution through government or not. I don't know, but it would most likely be in the form of a law or something to keep that person of the lower income where they are, instead of necessarily like the BHA. I won't say tried to do, but they heavy-handedly tried to do.
Yeah.
Because at some point it's probably going to happen. When I had Carlos on here, we actually recorded at this Starbucks, and I said, if the gentrification problem is people really don't want a Starbucks in their neighborhood, again, I think that's a good problem to have. I love Starbucks, but
I like the open bathrooms.
Yeah.
Right.
But the point being is like, Starbucks is an American semi-upscale cultural type of thing. You got a Starbucks in your neighborhood's probably doing okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a fake commercial third place.
Yeah, and Starbucks does not endorse this podcast, but I will happily accept payment for having them on this one. But you see my point.
Yeah.
So it's about trade-offs, and I can definitely recognize and sympathize and empathize with the individuals that are struggling to stay in a neighborhood, in a community that they've been in for a long time, but earn a lower income. But people who are bettering themselves are doing so to better themselves and have a better life, better education, better family for their kids and their grandkids, and et cetera, and right on down from generation after generation. How can those community members who do that be responsible to those who are not, at the same time manage that? And maybe you don't have an answer. I'm just saying I think that's the struggle and the crux of it, because I think we hear about gentrification and some people go, they're pointing fingers each way, and it comes across as, well, we don't want those people in our neighborhood, but you know what? There's benefits to that. There's trade-offs, and I want to have conversations like this, and we've gone over an hour, so maybe we can wrap. It's been a fast hour, but maybe we can kind of come to some kind of closure that gets us to a point where it's not necessarily, we're a bit more open-minded about what the future might hold. So I'll leave that both to you.
You mentioned it earlier, though, about when you don't know what you know, and when you do better, you know better.
Yeah.
Right? And so you mentioned it earlier when we were talking about the need for the Urban League. And I think that's the crux of the issue. Like, you have people who have done their due diligence, have tried to better themselves, have made those moves to elevate themselves and whatever that elevation means for them. And then you have the other people who are still on that level that they just cannot seem to move off that level for whatever reason. And maybe it's because they don't know. And so that's kind of the job of the Urban League, to let you know that there is a better path for you, and we can help you get to that better path. Now the question is, you can lead a horse to the water, but can you make them drink?
Yeah.
And so that's where the other issue comes into play too. And I hesitate with the whole notion of policy, because policy can do damage. And policy can do everlasting damage. And, super predators is a prime example of policy doing damage.
Certainly.
And so policy is not always a solution. And I think that's what we need to understand. Personally, taking off the Urban League hat, I am a very conservative Democrat. I believe in the free market. I also believe that there are policy and social policy issues that we can institute on a limited basis that will help everybody become on the same playing field. And so I think that's where we have to go in terms of how we look at this whole issue, is that the free market is not a bad thing. Having your self-agenda is not a bad thing. It's just about taking those two concepts and making sure that everybody can have the same opportunities that you're being afforded with that situation. And there are always going to be people that don't want to.
Equality of opportunity.
Exactly. Equality and equity. And there are always going to be people that don't want it. And you cannot help that.
Right.
That's just the way human nature is. But I think a majority of people do.
Right.
And we have to be able to give them that opportunity so they can realize that dream.
Now, how am I supposed to follow that?
You don't have to. That was pretty good.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, as you know, I like policy. I do like policy.
Hey, remember when we were talking about the disagreement on how? This is it right here.
She's a little more progressive.
On how. And honestly, I feel that if the government's going to exist, the government needs to exist for the people. Like, if the government and some of the policies that they made are what got us into this situation, then why in the world shouldn't we use the same tool to get us out of some of those situations?
Can you undo?
You're going to close my closing statement.
ahead.
You all really?
No, I'd like you to go back and forth on this because this is good.
I didn't interrupt you.
Say what you got to say.
But this is the good thing about podcasts. There's no time limit. You can finish up and you can go ahead. Go ahead, Kristen.
You're right.
When I think about the fact that redlining was a policy, and that we can, yes, that was a policy. That was a policy that led to so many people not being able to find homes in the neighborhoods that they wanted to, while also providing a vehicle for increased income and stable living for the largely white community. So if you're telling me that we can't create a policy to make sure that some of that equity comes back with some of those underserved populations being able to get their first homes, I think that's crazy to not want to use this tool that exists for something like that. When I think of entire areas where the median worth is in a very healthy 6 figures, and they're building new apartments, especially when they're building new high-rises, I look at inclusive zoning. Like, some of those should be affordable. Some of those should have a little bit of a moderation, especially if you are asking for tax breaks but you don't want to give anything back. I'm sorry, but that's not going to be okay. We have to use these tools to correct some of the wrongs that the tools made in the first place. But additionally, it's better for everybody. We know that diversity is better in general, especially for racial diversity. We champion that, especially at our college levels, at our jobs. But socioeconomic diversity is also incredibly important. It is better for a child to grow up in a neighborhood where they are exposed to a wealth of different opportunities and different lifestyles, and internalize that and take those ideas of thinking about other people, of knowing these other ways of living, and bringing that into their decision-making process no matter where they are. We're here because we believe in having a conversation and not staying in an echo chamber. But zoning especially can create lifelong echo chambers, but there's a possibility that zoning can help be used to destroy some of them.
You brought up a lot of good points.
Thanks.
And I'm going to try to... No, and I'm going to try to point
Rachelle
them out
to give her
because...
rebuttal. She's like waiting so patiently.
Do you want... Go for
like,
it. No. Go ahead. Because I'm going to try to remember your points. I had something to say on it, but go ahead,
Okay.
Rachelle.
So my thing is, how much policy can correct policy? Like, how much... You can put policy on top of policy, but at the end of the day, you can overcorrect, just like you can undercorrect. And so it's just like... She
stole my answer for the first one, by the way. But go ahead.
I knew that was going to be it, so I was like, it doesn't even matter which one of them does it. Let's just give it to the black woman.
You can overcorrect on policy.
Yes, you can.
So, for example, you have the 3 strikes law, and that was a overcorrection. I mean, it was needed at the time during the 80s. It was definitely needed at that time during the 80s when they put those policies in place, because there was a lot of crime, there was a lot of drugs, and there needed to be a swift, I'm talking about the drug crime laws, I'm sorry. There needed to be a swift response to drugs flooding into this country. But once they realized that the situation had ebbed and things had slowed down, there was no slowing down on the policy. They continued to have that war on drugs, which turned into more of a class war and a race war. But at the end of the day, how much can you overcorrect? How much can you correct policy on top of policy? At this point in time, and the policy also at the same time has a lot to do with people who are in government.
Yes.
And the people who are in government, love Republicans, but the people who are in government right now are not paying attention to that overcorrection, and I believe that they're swinging the pendulum back the other way.
So good points, because
Very.
for the conservative Republicans like myself should be in the favor of less government involvement in our lives. For the examples that you brought up, which are good examples of policy, the effects of policy. So you brought up. I'm sorry, I forgot the first. So the first one was redlining was one of them, right? So redlining took place, right, and it was a policy that affected communities negatively. Where we've covered this on my podcast before, actually, where essentially banks drew red lines around neighborhoods, hence the term redline, and those neighborhoods were kind of no loan zones, so to speak, where people couldn't get capital into those zones, right?
Right.
So the policy correction on that matter was what I think Bill Clinton did in the 90s. He signed, the Community Reinvestment Act, where he signed more teeth, where it said, okay, rather than just remove the red lines and saying you can't do that, they overcorrected, and they say, well, you must loan to people who might not otherwise buy loans. Not people who just getting regular loans who had a good income, wanted to move into those certain neighborhoods. That would have been removal of the policy and allowed that money to come in. But instead, they went further. They went overcorrect and said, no, you have to start loaning to people that you otherwise might not have. And that created that was kind of the foundation of the financial crisis. Now, granted, there were all kind of financial instruments.
Which I would say was the abuse of the free market.
Right. So there were all kinds
of
financial instruments that were developed off of that, and it exploded and ballooned and mushroomed, and it had the really terrible effects that it did. But I think you can draw a good example by that and saying, you know what, just remove the policy. If the policy is bad, so zoning laws is a good example. You mentioned that before. So zoning laws, right? If you have zoning laws in a neighborhood saying you can't do this, you can't do that, and you can't do that either. Okay, well, what's the policy correction? Well, how about saying you can't do that, and how about just saying, okay, you can do that, and that's like removal of the policy. Now you start to overcorrect when you say you must do this on top of removing those zoning laws. So, for instance, all right, you can put that there, but you must have retail space there, or you must have purely retail there and only residential there, and you're going, well, then I thought this was all residential, and then you know what I'm saying.
Right.
So you don't know what the outcomes of the overcorrection might be.
We also create ways to address that. I mean, I very frequently go to the Zoning Board of Appeals because Boston has not redone its zoning as a city in decades. In decades in some of the neighborhoods here,
right.
So that you have all of this spot zoning, and you can go and you can be a developer and you can say, I know what this is zoned for, but I would like to do this other things. And sometimes it goes forward and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they hold to the zoning law, and sometimes, especially if the community feels like it is a good thing to have, they can go and say, we know that you're not supposed to build this thing here, but we as a community feel that this would be a very real benefit to us,
right.
And we would like to support a better and more inclusive, looking at this law, and please let this go forward. And that is what the Zoning Board of Appeals is there to listen to and allow. So hardline policy, like 3 strikes, is an overcorrection, but you can have to just throw all the policy, to me, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, rather than my other favorite Southernism of eating the chicken and spitting out the bones.
Okay.
I know. Sorry, I'm from Ohio.
All right, so on that, and I know we're running late, and I don't want to keep you guys here. Would you agree, and you kind of alluded to it in what you just said, the community helps make that decision?
Yeah.
Would you agree, like I think I would agree as a Republican who supports federalism and local government is the better government, would you agree that those community decisions are better than city decisions, better than county decisions, better than state, better than federal decisions? Meaning the community knows what's best for its community and can kind of come to a consensus of whether or not they want, say, that cannabis shop in their neighborhood, or you know what, maybe they don't want it in their neighborhood and they're not so sure.
But you have to have the community, though.
What's that?
But you have to have that.
You do.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
And if it's the same 8 people who already knew to go to the thing
Right.
every single time who don't like this thing, even though 90% of the other people, if they had only known about that meeting or that opportunity to weigh in, or if that process even existed,
Right.
well, then I can't trust that part of that community.
You know,
You're creating the echo chamber.
That might
Right.
that's a good. I think that's a good point to wrap up on, because if the people who aren't involved in the community to begin with, then the decisions that get made kind of default up to maybe a higher level that's less desirable than people who get involved in their
And
community.
if you truly want community, then you will do the work to bring in the other voices. If that's what you truly want is community and not your own little curated world, you'll bring in the rest of the voices in your neighborhood.
Right. If you want to get away from the Stepford Wives mentality, then do the work to make sure that you have diverse thought, diverse action, and diverse something else. I was going to say something else.
Ideas?
Ideas. Thank you.
See, look at that little bipartisan action. I like that. That's a good note to end on.
Subscribe to us on iTunes.
Yes.
Subscribe
Yay.
to us on YouTube. We're on SoundCloud. We're on Stitcher. We're on all the Google Play. We're on all the podcatchers. Video of this podcast will be on YouTube. I want to sincerely thank you, Rachelle and Kristen, for coming on the Lincoln Review podcast. I think this was a fabulous conversation. I hope this conversation gets shared all over the country.
Definitely.
It's a valuable
Totally.
one, and a fun one. And I think that the more conversations we have like this, the better off we're going to be. With all the craziness going on in our world, we can come together, have a cup of coffee, and talk about what we care about, and maybe we disagree on how to get there, but we want to get there. With that, everybody, I will bid you a good evening.
Thanks.
And
Happy
take
to
care.
be here. Let us come back. We're
Absolutely. Like we're already ready for round 2.
happy. Definitely.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.